This is I do, you do answers for multiplication and division of integers. So I have the problem -3 times -2, and to be honest, this is one that is hard to understand and hard to explain as a math teacher. So I'm going to talk about the rule. The rule for multiplying and dividing negatives is you can count the negatives, and if you have an even number of negatives, then your answer is positive. And if you have an odd number, then your answer is negative. So let's say I had a negative times a negative times a negative times a negative. We would count the negatives. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives. That's an even number. Your answer would be positive. So if I go up to this problem up here, I have a -3 times a -2. A negative times a negative, that's 2, which is an even number, so your answer is going to be positive. Now you just do the problem with the absolute value of -3 times the absolute value of -2. So really you're just going back to third grade and doing 3 times 2, which is 6, but applying an upper level understanding of how to figure out whether it's positive or negative. Another way to think about this problem is it's the opposite. I'm going to read the first negative as the opposite. So it's the opposite of 3 -2's. Well, if this is 0, here's 1 -2, here's 2 -2's, here's 3 -2's. This would put you at -2, this would put you at -4, this would put you at -6. This would be what 3 -2's is, but that first one that I read is opposite. The opposite of -6 then is all the way over here at +6. That's how we can think about that one. Second problem, I'm just going to count the negatives. I have 1 negative, 2 negatives, 3 negatives. I'm not talking about the numbers 1, 2, and 3. I'm just counting the negatives. There's 1 sign, there's 2 signs, there's 3 signs. 3 is odd, which means my answer is going to be negative. So my answer is negative, whatever the absolute value of this is. So 5 times 1 times 2 times 3. 5 times 1 is 5, times 2 is 10, times 3 is 30. But since it was an odd number of negatives, my answer is -30. And I don't like the way this one looks, so I'm going to go ahead and write it like I should have written it. Should have taken the time to do it like this. So now I have this problem that's all multiplication division. By the way, this counting the negatives only works if the entire problem that you're doing is multiplication and division. If there's addition and subtraction, we have to stop and do those rules separately. So I can just count the negatives. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. That's an even number of negatives, so my answer is going to be positive. So now I'm just doing the absolute value of 3, which is 3, times the absolute value of -4, which is 4. 3 times 4 is 12. On the bottom I have -2. Well, the absolute value of that is 2, and the absolute value of -2 is 2, so 2 times 2 is 4. When I take 12 divided by 4, I get 3, and I already know my answer is +3 because I counted an even number of negatives in that problem. This one's short and sweet. I count the negatives. I have 1 negative, so it's going to be negative. 1 is odd. So now 14 divided by 7 is 2, so my answer is going to be -2. All right, this problem is just a whole bunch of 1s multiplied. Well, 1 times 1 times 1 all day long is just 1. So I know my answer is either going to be positive or -1. I just got to count the negatives to find out. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives. That's even, so my answer is positive. +1 is your answer. I'm just going to do all the math with the absolute values. So 2 times 3 is 6, times 4 is 24, 4 times 2 is 48. And then I'm going to count the negatives. I have 1, 2 negatives. 2 is even again. So your answer is +48. Since it's an even number of negatives multiplied together, we get a positive answer. Another quick, easy one. I count the negatives. I have 1 negative, so my answer is going to be negative because that's an odd number of negatives. 10 divided by 2 is 5, so my answer is -5. Again, I'm going to write this the way I should have written it, with an actual exponent, -1 to the 35th power. Now you might only see one negative, but this problem represents -1 times -1 times -1 times -1, 35 of those. So how many negatives do I really have? I have 35 negatives. All I'm looking at is this number even or odd? It's odd, so your answer is going to be negative. And 1 times 1 times 1 all day long is 1. So if I would have had -1 to the 406th power, now I have an even number, right? So now it would be a +1. One thing that I might as well mention while we're here, be really careful, because if you had something like this, -1 to the 44th power, You might think you have 44 negatives on that problem, but you really only have one negative on that problem. Notice how what was going to the exponent on all these was the parentheses, so everything in that parenthesis went to that exponent. On this one, that 44 only goes to the 1, so I would read this one a little bit different. Let me read this one to you. This one I would read negative 1 to the 35th power. This one I read the opposite of 1 to the 44th power. So even though it looks like you have 44 negatives, you really only have 1. So I would do 1 to the 44th power, which would be 1. And then I want the opposite of that. That one would turn to a negative 1. So be careful with that.